Welcome everyone to the Inclusion Conversation Season 2. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Solène Anglaret and I'm the host of the Inclusion Conversation. The Inclusion Conversation is a talk show that aims to break down borders and bring people closer together, one conversation at a time. I'm also the founder of Be Beyond Borders, and basically I just love talking and I just love writing. So that's why I put this show together for everyone. I'm so excited that today we're going to be talking about the language of disability, and specifically this season 2, I'm going to be focusing on disability and neurodiversity. So I'm so happy and grateful that you all joined today, and I look forward to hopefully seeing many of you go for this journey of learning together during this season. So what about the hour that we're going to spend together tonight? The first part is going to be myself asking questions to our amazing guests, Rox and Martyn. And then the second part, the second half hour, will be all about all of you who have joined us, and you'll be welcome to sharing your own stories, asking questions, literally anything. And that second half is not recorded, so you can really let it all out, and we love it this way. In terms of a few reminders for the conversation, so like I said, the first half is being recorded. If you prefer to have your cameras off during that part, that's totally fine. But if you're comfortable to have the cameras on, we love seeing lots of faces. It makes us feel like we're not talking into the ether. In terms of the closed captions, I've enabled them already, so you should be seeing them at the bottom of your screen. Any issues, let me know. We have the chat open, so for anyone who wants to still share their favorite word, we'd love to start with that. And if you have any questions that pop along in your mind during the talk, feel free to put them on there and I will be asking them. Mindset, please keep an open mind. This is all about learning together. We all have different opinions, different lived experiences. So it's all about respecting each other and leading with kindness throughout the conversation. And at the same time, creating a safe space for any challenge and difficult conversations as well. There are no breaks planned, so if you need one, take one. No need to raise your hand for that. That's all good. So tonight, I'm so happy to be joined by Rox and Martyn, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So we're literally going to dive in. I will stop sharing my screen. Rox, Martyn, first of all, thank you. And second of all, can you tell us a little bit more about you first? Rox, do you want to go first? Tell us a bit about you.
Hello, I am Roxanne still. I come from a place of lived experience with cerebral palsy, which for me looks like 99% of the time. I use a manual wheelchair. I also use...
Oh, Rox, I think you've muted yourself.
Oh, sorry, you wouldn't believe I do this for a living. I do apologise. Yes, so I do use the support of PAs to remain independent at home and at work, as well as using assistive technology to enable me. As I say, I do speak for a living. There is a reason I love doing that. And language and communications is one of my favourite, and I think one of the most important subjects. When we talk about disability inclusion or inclusion practices, I think the biggest thing that we can have in our toolbox is confidence around the language we use.
That's a great intro and setting the scene for what's to come. Martyn, what about you? Tell us a bit about you.
Thank you. Yeah, good to see everyone here tonight, and thanks for having me on the show, Solène. So yeah, lived experience wise, I've got spinal muscular atrophy. So I'm a power wheelchair user. I have living care support, and obviously from a sort of disability inclusion perspective, physical environment, inclusive design is pretty important. The whole being able to get a heavy wheelchair onto modes of transport and into buildings has always been the big thing to sort of, for my personal overcoming of barriers. But yeah, professionally, I worked for a disability charity for about 5 years when I finished university. And then I left there in 2011. And since then, I've been doing a mixture of kind of speaking and content creation and entrepreneurship. I've started a couple of businesses, and I'm currently running Purple Goat, which is a disability marketing agency. So through that time, definitely gained more empathy of other impairments and other types of barriers and sort of disability inclusion beyond my own experience. And really echoing what Roxanne said, I think language is such a powerful tool in any sort of civil rights movement. I think it's a very important thing to understand around disability culture, disability history. So I'm looking forward to chatting with everyone, but also learning from everyone today as well.
Yes, I totally agree with the importance of language. Really, language can connect us, but it can also divide us. So yeah, very interested to dive into this topic. Really, really happy to have you here. So how would you define disability? Let's start with, setting the scene. Who wants to go first?
You want to go, Roxanne?
Absolutely. I was trying to give space because I'm sure Celine will tell you I could talk on this for half an hour in itself. How would I define disability? Well, we talk about the definitions of disability a lot in work, but how would I define it personally? And I really wanted to come up with a real distinct answer. And that was a real challenge because for me, my disabling experience can vary depending on what environment I'm in and who I'm with. But actually, if I just look at the concept of how I see myself as a disabled person in general, I acknowledge I am a disabled person that's disabled by barriers in society, whether that be those physical access barriers like Martyn mentioned, those attitudinal barriers from other individuals, or even internalized barriers by myself, or even systems and support systems in place. But I think there's a continuation as well. I believe my disability really gives me a new perspective. It gives me potential to look at progression in the world and, dare I say, opportunities for innovation. So there's a really positive side to my disabling experience for me personally.
What about you, Martyn?
Yeah, I think unsurprisingly, a lot of what Roxanne said is where I come from too. I think that broad notion around the social model and the fact that I have this medical condition or impairment called spinal muscular atrophy. Under the older medical model, it would have been about how to cure me of spinal muscular atrophy and how I can be involved in society the way someone, inverted commas, non-disabled would be. And I'm so glad we shifted from the medical model to the social model and said, well, actually, let's look at the design of the physical environment, the attitudes, as Roxanne said. And I think internal ableism is definitely a barrier that we've all become more aware of the last 10, 20 years, sort of part of social model thinking. But, beyond the fact the world hasn't been designed, inverted commas, for all people, for all disabled people, there's an internalization of that, which is something that as individuals we have to overcome too. I also feel that through the medical model and the social model, there's space for a newer model, and it doesn't mean instead of social model, it's more building upon it. And, the social model grew out of the 70s and 80s, and we've got, legal rights now under the Equality Act. And, there's been a lot of progress the last decades. There's unfortunately still a fair way to go as well. But yeah, I think that there's something against what Roxanne said about innovation and the value of disabled people, not just empowering our own community, but what if all the things we've experienced and the skills we have gained through those barriers and to a degree adversity, what if all of the world could benefit from our perspective and our expertise? And whether that fits under the social model or not is slightly irrelevant. I just think it's about, let's keep progressing the models and progressing the use of language, because the world moves on, so should all of these things as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective, and we'll come back to the model, and I'll turn to you, Roxanne, for a bit more definition on those, I think, for everyone, in case anyone hasn't heard of it before. Yeah, just to reflect on that, like, I think, well, actually, recently, I don't know if everyone saw, but London Fashion Week had the brand Unhidden by Victoria Jenkins, which was showcased at Fashion Week, and all the models were disabled models. And one of the T-shirts that was on was saying, "Disability is not a bad word." And I think it's a really interesting journey to entering this space. And for me personally, before entering this space, I thought I can't say disability, because I thought it sounds bad for the person. And that wasn't until understanding what you've both said, which is disabled by the world, disabled by society, rather than an attribute of the person per se, that completely shifts your perspective. And I think, you know, when we're in this space, we think everybody knows this. Everybody knows the difference between medical and social model. Everybody knows the definition of disability. But actually, I think there's still a lot of education to be done around that. And that's why I'm so glad that we're doing this tonight. So Rox, coming back to you around the models that Martyn has mentioned, medical model, social model, and I know that you often talk about celebratory models. So do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Absolutely. And here I have to give a hat tip to DNA, because it is DNA's model, which is built upon the champion model, which is the idea that everyone in any space has a set of skills. And if we work together as a society, then we can all thrive. So, for example, if we were setting up an office or a business together, you might want me pitching at a meeting because I think I'm pretty good at speaking. I think that's a skill. But you probably wouldn't want me putting the furniture together, because that's not really a skill of mine. So we can look at how we can thrive together, and also acknowledge that sometimes barriers just can't be removed. So it's not as simple as to say put in a ramp instead of stairs, but actually those that might have experience of, say, chronic fatigue or pain might have different experiences on a daily basis. So like Martyn said, with that kind of inclusive design, thinking about how we can set up environments that have those assistive factors already built in. So, for example, feeling enabled to work from home, if you're not able to get into an office, would be an idea of a celebratory model. I think what's important to talk about with the models, obviously I could go through each model, but we don't have time, I'm sure, is it's really, for those who may not have heard of it, it is a lens in which we look at disability through, and there are multiple lenses, and some people can be perceived through different lenses at different times. And yes, lenses have a role, but sometimes when those lenses are used in the wrong spaces, it can create that kind of deficit-based look at disabled people. For example, I like to say, yes, there are spaces that reading glasses are good to use. There's spaces that driving glasses are good to use. But if you're wearing your sunglasses while driving, that might not be as supportive. So it's about using the right lens in the right spaces. And also thinking about how, if the way we perceive and see the world often defines the language we use, because it can affect how we feel. So I think the key models that we could explore or should explore, and maybe Martyn will want to expand on these, are obviously the medical model that Martyn touched on, the idea that we're unable to participate, we are someone that needs to be fixed or cured. We've got the charity model. So we're not saying charity is bad. Honestly, disabled people have been supported and really thrive because of charity, but it's that legacy that charity has left. For example, those kind of telethons and around the language used with disability, and thinking and acknowledging that sometimes the charity model is the only lens people have had the experience to see disabled people through. So if we're looking at a charity advert that invokes pity or sympathy, and that's the only lens or pair of glasses they've got to use to look at disability, how that affects the way that we perceive people in a work environment or in a social space. And obviously, I touched on the charity model that DNA used, but also the rights model of disability. So really taking on that label of disabled person with a capital D, to acknowledge how those kind of governmental structures impact the way we are perceived and received and interact with society. As I say, that is a very brief overview. I could probably talk on that for about half an hour, but I want to obviously not talk the whole time. So sorry about that. Really
No,
hard to make that subject think.
Yeah, it's really important to set the scene, I think, and for anyone who hasn't heard of the models, you know, go and do a little search and have a read in your own time. It is really interesting, and like Martyn said, there's even opportunity to look at developing new models and different lenses, you know, in the future as well. So yeah, I think this is really important to set the scene. A question that I was asking myself a lot when I started my role in this space and started talking about disability a lot is it disabled person or person with disability? So Martyn, I see you smiling. So tell us.
Yeah, I mentioned at the beginning, I knew I would be able to learn something today, as much as share my experience, and the celebratory model is not one I'd specifically come across, but it really resonates, and it typifies that sense of disabled people being at the forefront of, you know, what we need and want from our life and from the world and from support services. So I'm going to definitely go in and read up a bit more and learn a bit more about that model. So thank you, Rox. And yeah, I think that the natural sort of knock on of the models, as you said, Solène, is, you know, the whole, is it disabled people, people with disabilities? And, you know, sometimes there's an argument that can be so fraught or divisive amongst the community, let alone beyond the community, where it probably confuses people. There's an element of, let's not let the language get in the way of actually working out how to improve healthcare and social care and employment and, you know, all of the parts of life. But on the other hand, as we said at the beginning, language is very important as a tool to create change in the ways of just sort of those areas I mentioned. So for me, and particularly in the UK, where we are more social model kind of focus or lens, as Roxanne said, it would for me be disabled people, because it's disabled by the barriers. Whereas I know in the United States, for example, they like to say person first, that if you say disabled and then people, it diminishes the fact that we're people before having any sort of disability, whether that's from a medical lens or a societal lens. So in the USA, you'll hear people say people with disabilities more so. So I think from my side in the UK, the answer to give an answer is disabled people, but the true answer is it's kind of a personal preference of every disabled person. But what we definitely can't have is non-disabled people dictating what language is right or wrong. And the most important thing is around reclamation. So it's like, even when things were an insult 100 years to disabled people, certain words are coming back from the community because we're reclaiming that discrimination and oppression and owning that as well. So it's a really interesting world, this topic of language. And as Rox said, we could talk all day and all night about it. But yeah, I hope that just gives some insights into the disabled people versus people with disability around different cultures and around points of history and reclamation.
Yes, I think that's hugely helpful, and I can see Rox nodding a lot. So I think you're very aligned from what I know of what Rox would say on this, and we'll come to you very shortly. I think the global perspective is also fascinating. For example, in the UAE, they've just started using this new term called people with determination, which Well, for me seems very confusing, but is over there, the term being used, or like in France, and I know we have several people joining from France today, we use the term handicapé, which if you translate it to the English word is absolutely unacceptable here. So yeah, all of these global nuances are very, very interesting. So Rox, do you want to comment on, disabled people, people with disability, and any other global nuances that you've come across that you think are very interesting?
Absolutely. I mean, I mirror what Martyn says about disabled person for me personally, not only under the social model, but as an activist, taking on that label to fight for my rights. And like Martyn said, it's really important that whoever we're speaking to, we mirror that language choice that they want to use. I think what's important here is people get wrapped up in that language, but actually we've got to think about, when do we need to use that language? The disabled community only really wants to be acknowledged as disabled as bridging language until we create a society when that label isn't needed and I can be Roxanne. So it's really important to acknowledge that. And I know the word disabled makes a lot of people too uncomfortable because they're like, oh, you can't say that. Or, I don't see disability. You're not disabled. You can do anything you like. But this is an example of where language has positive roots, but can be really distorted over time. The prefix "dis" comes from the Latin to go a different way. It never actually meant unable in the first place. So as Martyn said, it's really important to remember that non-disabled people shouldn't dictate anything about us without us, really, because a lot of the time it's around comfort, and I think people need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. We can really make that change.
Absolutely. I love what you said about nothing without about us without us. That I think that's super, super important, and it happens way too often. And I'm going to read out Richard's comment from the chat. He said, well said, Martyn. Too often non-disabled people dictate the language that's acceptable or unacceptable. Me personally, you can call me a disabled person or a person with a disability. Just don't call me first thing in the morning. I just think brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And Chennai said that her favorite word at the moment is nuanced, which I think is, a very good word to describe also some of these answers, right? Because so much of language that we use is what both of you said about, self-identification. So what is the person comfortable and wanting to be, acknowledged as and addressed to as in the first place. So yeah, I wanted to ask you about neurodiversity, because some people in the neurodiverse community associate very much with disability, and that we fall under the wider umbrella. And then some people in the community say no, neurodiversity isn't disability. So it might be a tough one to answer, but I'm just curious to get your take on it.
Should I go, Solen?
Go for it.
Yeah. I think, the reason for me it's tough to directly answer is because I don't have that lived experience, and so I couldn't ever wish to speak to that to that whole lived experience, because I've not had that. And if I did, I would be hypocritical in the sense that we've just said we don't want non-disabled people talking on behalf of disabled people. But I think a broad sort of thought for me on it is that in the end, it shouldn't really matter whether it's classed in or out, versus are neurodiverse people getting the support that they need? Is there education to the rest of the world about the barriers that neurodiverse people are facing? And so, I'm sure someone else could speak loads about whether it does matter, whether it's labeled disability or not, and what appropriate language is good or bad. I'll leave that for them, and I'm sure people watching have experiences to share, or even follow people on Instagram that can educate on that. But I think my overriding thought is beyond asking people neurodiversity, it's that point we've been saying, really. It's about how do we have progress? How do we have inclusion? And as long as that's the North Star, and in the end, the labels and the words become irrelevant because everyone's able to live the life they want to live, that's the point of all of this for me.
Yeah, what do we do in the meantime? Rox, I think you've got lived experience of both, so what's your view?
I call myself, as you may remember, neurodiverse pattern pending, because we know it's really hard to get a diagnosis, especially if you've got other diagnoses such as cerebral palsy, which can impact processing, which could mirror neurodiverse experiences. It goes again to the language of it being everyone else's an individual choice when it comes to neurodiversity, of course. And there may be some experiences, and I'm not speaking for any individuals, where people don't want to associate as being disabled because of that kind of stigma that we're already talking about, where people like to see it as differences. But with neurodiversity, from my point of view, and from like a DNA point of view, it's really helped me explore that label. And we like to acknowledge that everyone is neurodiverse, but not everyone is marginalized by it. So not everyone is facing barriers. So yes, some people might acknowledge that label under a level of disablement, others may not. And again, I think it's about that personal journey and where they are, even with the terminology around neurodiversity or disability. But in broadest terms, in like legal terms and protection, for those who may have a disabled label or be experiencing barriers, they would be protected under that disability law in the larger grand scheme of things. But again, it doesn't matter how people want to associate, but there might be reasons behind why certain people don't want to associate, and that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, it's back to Rox's point about different lenses and different contexts. So there's the legal framework under the Equality Act, there's the, is someone being discriminated against or like a hate crime in that kind of context? Is it because getting employment is more difficult or into education? And is it just to understand yourself better, to know that there's a diagnosis around neurodiversity? I can imagine, empathize that it might just be a personal journey that's useful for, but it doesn't mean the whole world has to know about it. So yeah, I really like what Rox just said. It's that different lenses and different contexts is actually very applicable again.
Yeah, and sometimes also to get those reasonable adjustments to make sure that you're able to, do whatever it is that you want to do. So yeah, that can be really useful to have that neurodiverse association or the disability association. But yeah, it's just very interesting to observe kind of the dialogue there. And I think you made a very good point as well, Rox, about connecting it to the stigma and how if we are able to remove stigma from a lot of these words and experiences, then we'll be able to, get closer together in so many different ways. Yeah, well, talking about terms and terminology and stigma attached to it and all these different things, do's and don'ts. I know we don't usually give them out because it depends on everyone and all that, but help us out, 20 of us on the call. Help us out. Are there words that recommend using, and any words that you absolutely don't recommend using?
I mean, when I've ran disability and diversity inclusion training over the years, it's quite a popular part of it to really get everyone to workshop what words are appropriate and inappropriate. And I guess to your question, Solange, like there are absolute obvious ones. Like I think kind of, I'm just going to say a couple of negative words, feeling uncomfortable using them, but sort of retard and spastic are definitely no's if we're going to be really blunt, and like that would definitely be a no, right? And I'm just saying that to give like a tangible answer. And on the other side, you know, from a sort of social model perspective, I would say I'm a wheelchair user, I'm not wheelchair bound. And that's a more nuanced one for a lot of people. There's a sort of colloquial, traditional, oh, he or she is wheelchair bound. But, you know, we're not bound by the wheelchair, we use a wheelchair. So I just wanted to give a very polar sort of couple of definitely not good words, and then a kind of wheelchair user is a good one. But I think just in the end, though, for me, it's about that context and that individuality and being, you know, engaging and empathetic with the people that you're around. So in the end, I would say if people aren't sure, it's best to ask how someone would prefer to be spoken about, because yeah, maybe someone prefers wheelchair bound to wheelchair user, and that's their personal preference, right? So yeah, it can be a lot of landmines, and it can be quite confusing, and that can evoke quite a lot of fear and then a lack of confidence to even engage with disability and disabled people. So I think in the end, it's about having a human experience and just meeting people as they are, and having empathy and kindness like we should, disability or not disability.
Can I jump in?
Of course.
Sorry, I felt like I couldn't say nothing on this particular question. Can't help myself. As I say, there is a reason I talk for a living. I didn't really want to go through and give like a list of like words that are okay and words that are not. What I would rather say is, let's again look through those lenses and make sure that we're not using language that might go towards bias on an unconscious or conscious basis. So thinking about how even the words make us feel. For example, I'll use the word wheelchair bound as an example. I think that has negative connotations even when we say it. It also kind of reinforces that medical and tragedy of a charity unable. It also doesn't speak to the full experience of a wheelchair user, for example, the kind of ambulatory wheelchair user. And we have to remember that a lot of language we use is steeped in a lot of history that can bring up a lot of trauma and stigma. So, for example, wheelchair bound literally comes from, I'd like to say it was thousands of years ago, but unfortunately it was quite close in history. People would quite simply be put in homes, people like me, to be looked after, but instead of actually being cared for, they'd quite simply be bound to their wheelchair. So we've got to remember that a lot of this language use is steeped in stigma. And I think it's good to mention mental health here. This would also be protected as a disability. We have to move away from words like mental, crazy, or nuts when describing a person, and thinking about how that speaks to an individual. So thinking, when we're using a word, does it sound like it's going towards a deficit, or is there a more positive or neutral term? For example, wheelchair user.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up around mental health, because I was going to add something around that, because obviously having lived experience of long-term mental health condition, I think, you know, words like psycho or crazy, insane, all these words, you know, don't use them for a person, please. You know, if you say this, I don't know, this event was crazy, I don't mind. I mean, that's part of, you know, language, and maybe some other people mind though. So of course, like we said, you know, make sure to check with the person. But if it's about a person, there's so many other words, beautiful, amazing words to use instead of those ones. So that would be my little addition there. And we are getting close to wrapping up this part and moving to the conversation with everyone. So just one last question, as briefly as you can. What would you recommend to anyone who feels like they've said the wrong thing? What do they do then? Rox?
I would say, honestly, don't worry about it too much, because straight away, I mean, because you find that people might realize they've said something, suddenly overcorrect and apologize, and then it really derails the conversation and focuses on the fact that someone's done something wrong. Apologize, reflect and educate yourself, and also don't expect the individual that you could potentially offended to educate yourself or forgive you. A lot of people spend time apologizing because what they want is not for us to feel better, but them to feel better about what they've done. And also think about, educating yourself by engaging on social media or using organizations like Diversity and Ability for training, for example, if it's in a workplace. Don't put that on the individual to educate you, but also don't over worry about it, because I don't think over worrying about it fixes the problem.
Yeah, and I think everything Rox said, I fully agree from that perspective of that sort of individual, as you said in the question, and how to react to that. I suppose just building on that, the last couple of years with Purple Goat, we've been working with some really big companies and trying to help the staff at these companies to understand disability more and to create products and services that are more suitable for disabled people, and to have marketing campaigns that are more representative. And I think going through that process where we've been selling our services to these brands, the fear is palpable. You can feel the fear they have of doing and saying the wrong thing. And so I think whilst everything, absolutely, first of all, what Rox said is right, for that person to educate themselves and seek the right education and to upskill themselves on it, I do think there's a role to play for us as disabled people. Not that individual or every individual is responsible to always be on and always be educating. But I think there is something about civil rights struggles where you have to essentially forgive your oppressor to move forward. And I know that's very lofty, but I've done a lot of reading around other civil rights, not just disability. And I guess my final point on it really is that maybe when we just talk about disability and we just talk about race and we just talk about gender, etc., we're missing a trick that a lot of the power to make change is quite concentrated in business and in politics. And actually, what if everyone that's being marginalized for reasons like disability, but as I said, other diversity inclusion areas, if everyone truly came together, I think that power of being citizens is where we could really shift the needle on having more services for people that need support, and more opportunities for people that currently face barriers to that. And I sort of referenced that slightly before we started, so then there's sort of things I've been playing around with in my mind the last year or two. It's like, now disabled rights are being regressive a little bit around politics and a little bit business, but definitely politics. Do we actually go back to the 70s and 80s of the same tactics and strategies as disability activists? Or do we try to create bigger movements of anyone in poverty, anyone struggling to get social care, anyone struggling to get employment? And so it's more like issue-based. And I think for me, that's something really interesting to explore going forward. So there's a few points there, but I think ultimately we have to help people overcome the fear. Otherwise, they're not going to feel empowered to remove these barriers as well.
Yeah. That was really powerful. I could visualize in my mind the intersectionality of all these movements and everyone kind of coming together, because yes, we do tend to work in silos, even when you see at an organization level having all the individual employee resource groups or whatever different organizations call them, separated. And it's like, well, how if we all came together and drove that agenda and helped people to feel more comfortable to talk about all of these different topics openly. So yeah, that's
even, sorry to interrupt, I was going to say that's even in disability, because we know there's 14 million disabled people in the UK, but I know one of the challenges in the 70s and 80s activism before leading up to the Disability Discrimination Act, it was hard to get everyone on the same page because of the different lived experiences as well. So it's the silos within disability as a community, and then absolutely to what we just said, beyond disability as well.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. I think that's a brilliant point to end on, and a call to action for everyone watching live and watching the recording to, you know, join us and join this movement. I'm just going to be sharing my screen for anyone watching the recording. It's going to end very shortly. Next time you have to join us live to be able to have the stories and questions and conversation at the end. If you are watching the recording, thank you so much. Join our next episode by signing up on Eventbrite. The next episode, I'll put it in the chat in a second for those here, is going to be about neurodiversity. What if we dropped the mask? It's going to be a very exciting conversation again. You can follow on Instagram at Be Beyond Borders, and also look at the website. And if you have a bit of time, jump on YouTube. On the Be Beyond Borders channel, you can watch all the previous episodes from season 1. We got very, very busy and touched on lots of different topics around diversity and inclusion. So, and whilst you're there, and if you are online watching the recording, don't forget to subscribe, like, and do all the things that people do on YouTube to help us continue to make this show. So that's it for me. For those watching the recording, thank you so much, and see you soon.